So good morning, everybody. Can we have the doors closed? Four words. 4 words. Those left furthest behind. I will say them again. Those left furthest behind. And I would like every person in the room to take 20 seconds and repeat them in your head. I may test you afterwards. Those left furthest behind. This 2 days where we look at Local 2030, where we look at the SDGs, where we look at localization, our anchor point, whether it's the shanty towns of the megacities, whether it's isolated communities in the Sahel, whether it's pockets of deep poverty, structural poverty in the post-industrial global north, whether it's the Eastern Cape, whether it's pockets of poverty in the subcontinent, those left furthest behind are the common thread for the next 2 days. Does anybody disagree? I will tell you who I am. The gentleman here. I'll come back to you at some point. Okay? We've got 2 important days. And what I want is for our opening panel, which is very distinguished, is to inject enough energy into the room now in the next 30 minutes so that by the end of day 2, we have a glowing orb of energy in the room where people are committed, where they're passionate, where you don't leave anything on the table. Whatever your institutional agenda is, whatever your personal agenda is, this meeting is about those left furthest behind, in my mind, and we can have a robust conversation. A bit of housekeeping. I'm Paul Clements Hunt. I have a company which is purely focused on sub-Saharan Africa and investment. No one in this room pays me any income, so I'm an independent moderator. I will moderate without fear or favor, and I will be direct. We have a very rich feast, which means we're going to have to, as speakers, serve up small portions. Time discipline is everything for the next 2 days because we want to ring fence a really robust conversation. Again, everybody in the room agree with that up to a point? Let's have some noddies. Let's have some noddies. Let me feel the energy back. We've got a distinguished panel, but I want energy from the participants first. Good? Okay, good. I can see you're a compliant group of people. Again, just in terms of the dynamics. A rich feast, lots of speakers. But I want to ring fence time to put the conversation out around the room, okay? So I would respectfully ask the speakers to really comply. We want espresso shots. We want adrenaline. We want the very best you've got in terms of ideas, and that stimulates the conversation. So, let's get going. Super distinguished first panel. But ahead of that, I'm glad to say, we are delighted to have Her Excellency Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, who needs no introductions, who will speak to us for the next few minutes on the whole issue of Local 2030 Hub for Sustainability Solutions. Let's have a brilliant 2 days, but an honest conversation. Nothing left on the table, and no iPhone pondering, please. So can the video roll? Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to send greetings to this important 2-day high-level event for the Local 2030 Hub for Sustainability Solutions. As we all know, the 2030 Agenda is ultimately a local agenda. It is in cities, states, provinces, and rural communities where all 17 SDGs will come to life. And during these meetings, this is where the United Nations and member states can learn from each other about how the agenda is being implemented. At the local level, I thank the founding partners of this work, the Global Task Force for Local and Regional Governments, Sweden, and the many UN agencies involved in the Local 2030 for promoting a new way of working for the UN system. Local 2030 is a strategic new platform managed by my office to achieve concrete objectives. It aims to strengthen UN collaboration, to implement the 2030 Agenda globally and on the ground through UN country teams. It will enable a network of hubs to develop and incubate new solutions based on the needs of local communities. It will help identify and solve bottlenecks that local governments face and that help funding reach the communities that need it. And it will ensure that data gathered by people and for people truly captures the reality on the ground. We have thought of new ideas to take Local 2030 forward, including developing Local 2030 ambassadors, launching a global data visualization platform to show successes and bottlenecks, and supporting country teams to develop whole-of-government approaches and start new hubs in local communities. We hope to support cities in the Global South to become creditworthy and raise their own financing for development, empower communities to conduct their own household surveys and risk mapping, and to work with local communities to translate their SDGs into their own contexts. These are just some ideas, and I count on you all to develop more this week. During the next 2 days, I hope to see new commitments and new partnerships based on new UN that works together based on expertise. Let us make the 2030 Agenda come to life, giving dignity to all at the local level. Let us earn the trust and respect of the communities left furthest behind. I wish you a very productive meeting, and I look forward to learning about the outcomes. Thank you.
Deputy Secretary General has been very kind and quiet, which is giving me the signal. I will not introduce each of the panel members now, but I will go to our first speaker. So I'd like to welcome His Excellency Ardal. You know what? That's a very, very good idea. I hate technology. So, His Excellency. Hello? Good. Bob, thank you. His Excellency Ardalan Shekarabi, who's Minister for Public Administration with the Swedish government. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, Minister. We're delighted to have you. Thank you.
Thank you for the energy and for reminding us about what this is about. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to participate today. Thank you also to the initiators of Local 2030 and for bringing together city and province leaders to share experiences, knowledge and challenges in order to accelerate and strengthen the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Sweden has a high ambition for the implementation of the agenda, both at home and by contributing globally. An essential factor behind the positive results in implementing the agenda in Sweden is the peaceful and democratic conditions that characterize our country. The administrative and democratic system in Sweden is geographically divided into 3 levels: central, regional, and local government, following the same national legislation. I firmly believe that local and regional government have a central role to play if we are to be successful in the transformation to a more sustainable society. In an international comparison, the regional and local self-governments stand out since they are responsible for tasks that in many other countries are performed by the central government or the private sector. This provides freedom to adapt services to local priorities, a changing world, as well as hotbed for technical and social innovations. All 17 goals of the agenda are, as you can see, relevant to local and regional governments. Their decisions affect the lives, living conditions, and health of the population and its opportunity to live on equal terms. They also address the goals at employers and consumers, and the majority of public procurements occur at the local and regional level. There is already a strong commitment and work done locally and regionally. One example is the city of Malmö that had adopted the 2030 Agenda and its goal as leading principles for the city. You will hear more about this tomorrow. We have our friends from Malmö here today. The municipalities and regions also play a significant role in collaborating and establishing partnerships with the local business community and civil society organizations. I will now turn to a broader perspective. There is locally and nationally extensive work on the 2030 Agenda in progress throughout the Swedish society. That is why we have, in addition to those mentioned in our national report, compiled a document with examples and reports of current work. It is really encouraging to take part of these examples. This Swedish societal model is built on a long tradition of cooperation. A focus on cooperation and partnership is also crucial for this agenda. Essential to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda is a broad ownership and participation among all stakeholders and actors in society. A number of stakeholder platforms and partnerships with a bearing on 2030 Agenda have already been created. In a questionnaire with answers from 206 municipalities and 19 county councils, more than a quarter collaborates with local business community and or civil society organizations concerning the agenda. The Swedish government believes that one of the success factors for the 2030 Agenda is the broad inclusion in developing these goals, not least in the regional and local level. Our National Agenda 2030 Committee, engaged in a broad dialogue, spreads good examples and stimulates dialogue with different actors involving also municipalities and regions. The government's ambition in designing the National Action Plan for the implementation of the 2030 Agenda will include the international, national, and local level. There are no shortcuts if we are to succeed to implement the 2030 Agenda. Commitment at the local level is key. There, we find a strong democratic legitimacy and closeness to the citizens, enabling partnership-driven process and innovative thinking about strategic and operational governance to achieve the agenda. A strong leadership is essential for our success. Since I have the privilege to talk to you today, representatives from the local level and from many actors, I would like to conclude with this. With a strong leadership at the local and national level, we can, together, strengthen and accelerate the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. Thank you.
No, Minister, thank you. Broad inclusion at the local level and no shortcuts. I like the no shortcuts bit, because that's speaking to reality. Minister, thank you for your opening comments, which frame things wonderfully. Now, just before we move to our second panelist, the way this is going to bounce is we're going to bounce through the panel with espresso shots, and then we're going to go into a bit of a flowing conversation, and then we're going to bring in a second wave of people. And that starts the conversation, okay? So there's no death by PowerPoint in this 2 days. No death by boredom. And anyone on their phone will be put onto a list. Unless it's a Samsung 7, okay. So let me move now to our second panelist, and we're delighted to have His Excellency Mr. Modest Mero, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the United Republic of Tanzania to the United Nations. Your Excellency, the floor is yours for 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Moderator. Thank you so much. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to this important meeting of high-level event for the Local 2030 Hub for Sustainability Solutions to represent the government of the United Republic of Tanzania. Indeed, this meeting is timely as we are now unfolding implementation of the SDGs at the national level. The SDGs objective of leaving no one behind is noble and important in changing circumstances of our people. The goals have been well tailored, fitting action of both governments, non-state actors, and private sector. Like the rest of the United Nations member states, Tanzania is deeply committed to work with all stakeholders in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the next 13 years. Looking at our national effort, like the case of MDGs, we acknowledge that this cannot be accomplished without the inclusion and full support of the people living in the communities where the 2030 Development Agenda is ultimately being implemented. We all know that poverty among the people of my country is still pervasive. As such, the fifth government of Tanzania has resolved to invest heavily in programs that focus on poverty eradication and at the same time linking the implementation of the SDGs as ultimate solution to make poverty a history. All goals are linked to poverty. There's no question about it. We believe that focusing SDGs will ultimately address deficits in economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Tanzania understands and values the role of local governments in facilitating the implementation of all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We have resolved to approach the implementation of SDGs through bottom-up approach in order to ensure that no one is left behind. Through this approach, we are running national workshops and seminars for the implementation of SDGs in order to ensure that the goals are adopted by local governments. In Tanzania and elsewhere, if I am not mistaken, members of parliament are at the grassroots, where a majority of the poor people lives. The members of parliament in Tanzania have been involved in the SDGs from the negotiation process, adoption, now implementation. In Tanzania, therefore, the SDGs have been taken to the people. While we understand that it's vital that national government work together with the United Nations system, local governments and private sector and public financials in order to complement own capacity to carry out our development action are working together. We are working very closely with the United Nations Resident Coordinator System, private sector interlocutors, non-state actors in order to encourage their participation and contribution to the implementation of the SDGs. We see added value in terms of their contribution in implementing the goals. Generally, Tanzania collaborates with the United Nations, building joint projects that help strengthen our national capacity, a system that was built during the MDGs. However, the thrust in SDG is more wider and vast. As such, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to convert these plans and projects into well-being of all our people in the context of SDGs. We see Local 2030 as a key to linking Tanzanians at the most local of level to expertise within the various United Nations system agency to guide us on how best we can translate the commitment into action to successfully implement the SDGs at the local level. The One UN system in Tanzania is doing a marvelous job in making sure that SDGs are well known from schools, universities, government offices, civil societies, and private sector. Because of this, we celebrate events such as today, where UN agencies, in conjunction with member states, subnational government, and civil society, come together to identify solutions to the most pressing development challenges of our time. We hope that new commitments over the next 2 days will be made by governments, civil societies, and corporations who are present in this room today. Furthermore, we are encouraged by the Local 2030 initiative to continue expanding their efforts and lend our full support to help global development efforts reach the local level where the real people live. To conclude, we're excited to see the overall results of this event, and we will be carefully following its future endeavors to boost implementation of SDG locally and globally. And thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting.
Your Excellency, marvelous time discipline. I love it. In 13 years, you've reminded us we've got 13 years to deliver on the SDGs, right? Yes. Who in the room has got a teenager of about 13, 14? Goes quick, right? Okay. So you've put the clock on it, and that's wonderful. Also, everything's linked to poverty and the most pressing challenges of our time. So take these points in. Feed your conversation, feed your questions. I'm now going to move on to our third opening panelist, Her Excellency Selina Cesar Chavanez, who's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Development and is the High-Level Political Forum Head of Delegation, the Government of Canada. The floor is yours for 3 to 4 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you and good morning to everyone, excellencies and distinguished guests. First, I'd like to thank the Office of the UN Secretary General for organizing the launch of Local 2030. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that the work of the World Council on City Data has undertaken to support this morning's discussion on data. Quickly, I'd like to acknowledge that we do have different levels of members of parliaments, local government, and academia here from Canada. This event is a measure of the growing interest on open data platforms, spurred in part by the approval of the first ISO standard on city metrics and the 2014 inaugural Global City Summit in Toronto, where the World Council on City Data was launched. Here we are nearly 2 years into Agenda 2030, and I'm sure all the stakeholders know that international governments alone do not have all the answers, nor do they have all the tools to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The time for operating in silos or compartmentalizing issues is well past. We are all in this together, and we want the same thing, a sustainable, equal, prosperous, and peaceful world. We cannot afford to leave anyone further behind on this journey out of poverty. We've seen how interconnected the SDGs are, and that human rights and gender equality must be respected for this to work, and for societies to be peaceful and inclusive. Canada recently launched our new Feminist International Assistance Policy. While gender equality has long been considered in Canada's international development programs, it will now take center stage with the empowerment of women and girls, and gender equality being one of our core policies and programs. Canada is first to acknowledge that if we are to end poverty and empower women and girls, evidence and knowledge sharing must be an integral part of their decisions and policies. We want solutions to persistent development challenges to endure the test of time and be able to adapt to an ever-changing world. Canada's new Feminist International Assistance Policy is designed to align with Agenda 2030 and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in a collective effort to end poverty. It will explicitly recognize that we cannot hope to accomplish this ambitious agenda if half the world's population is not included in decisions, in power, and in opportunities. We don't always hear about the need for stronger linkages between different orders of government to successfully implement plans or even gather data needed to formulate those plans. Success can only be achieved if we act in partnership with all levels of government, Indigenous peoples, civil society, private sector, academia, women, and importantly, youth. All of these development actors need to bring their most innovative voices and ideas to the table, and we must be willing to listen. Only then will policies and plans truly reflect the needs of everyone in our society to ensure that no one is truly left behind. Canada has a very inclusive society, and we stand for inclusion and equality in other parts of the world, too. At the 2016 Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Peru, Canada was a vocal champion for promoting the role of local governments in sustainable development. It is clear that cities and communities have a critical role to play in putting Agenda 2030 into action, and I know we also have an opportunity today to learn from the governors and mayors who are with us today. We must not only identify challenge, but we also must measure progress. That progress must be accessible and applicable to more than policy makers. It must include concerned people in the places they live and engage. There are 169 targets and 130 indicators that qualify development so that development actors can better understand global, regional, and national baselines in order to track progress made over the coming decades. It will be worth it. The data we gather will be able to make evidence-based decisions on the most effective policies and approaches to help the poorest and most vulnerable. Canada is a strong proponent of open government and open data in support of Agenda 2030, as demonstrated by our leadership in the International Aid Transparency Initiative and the Open Government Partnership. The data standard set by the IATI is already being used to publish data by more than 530 organizations, including UN agencies, foundations like Gates and Hewlett, approximately 20 donor countries, and hundreds of non-governmental agencies. I want to acknowledge and thank the interagency expert group and the support of national statistical offices, including Statistics Canada, which have been hard at work setting the appropriate indicators based on data from national statistical agencies, international organizations, and other stakeholders. The recent successful passage of the Agenda 2030 Indicator Framework at the General Assembly is a big step forward in setting the SDGs on a firm evidence stage. Of course, sound public policy needs to be there as a foundation for change, and that includes local governments. I thank you and look forward to listening to further discussion.
Your Excellency, packed with great stuff that we've got to unpack. No, I know, but it was almost too much. It was fantastic. Look, on data, I'm glad you've introduced data into the conversation because it's key. And this is a secret between you and me. But in February, I made a fatal error of discussing in the prep workshop for this event the fact that I didn't see data as sexy, okay? Now, one of your compatriots who's in the room, who shall remain nameless, within 30 minutes had turned me into a data obsessive because I was so in fear of stepping on that type of data booby trap. So thank you for introducing that into the room. I will mention no names, but no, seriously, Excellency, thank you, and again for the time discipline. No compartmentalization. Compartment. But it's key. Look, we're going to jump from the multilateral, the national level, now to subnational, and I'm delighted to offer the floor to the Honourable Barry Vrabanovich, who's the Mayor of Kitchener, Ontario, and also UCLG Treasurer and representative of the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments. So, Barry, the floor is yours for 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to share with you that local and regional governments around the world consider the 2030 Agenda a local agenda and a once-in-a-generation opportunity to trigger true universal transformation, and are committed to contribute to its achievement through their day-to-day work and from the proximity of their communities. The achievement of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals will not be possible without the full ownership of the local level and the embracing by civil society. With this conviction, city, local, and regional government networks are developing global, regional, and national systems of localization, working on awareness raising, the alignment of work plans, learning exchanges, local monitoring, and reporting. The networks gathered in the Global Task Force are convinced that only the full involvement of subnational governments at a country level and the recognition of the efforts of the local constituency globally can guarantee the achievement of the ambitious goals that have been set up. The political representatives gathered at the World Assembly of Local and Regional Governments have further expressed the need to ensure implementation of the new urban agenda in order to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Following the model of the national voluntary reviews presented by member states, our local, regional, and global networks have undergone a global initiative assessing the level of involvement of our constituency in the monitoring process. There are approximately 400,000 local and subnational governments in the countries that are presenting reviews in this HLPF, gathering together billions of people. Their reach to the communities and the catalytic role that they play in local development and the responsibility in the provision of many of the basic services and rights that are embedded in the 17 goals is enormous, if adequate resources, competencies, and ownership are ensured. However, at this moment, only 44 of the national reports mention the participation of local and regional governments in these mechanisms. Stronger partnerships will be necessary at all levels to trigger the kind of buy-in needed to make this agenda a success. Clearer recognition of subnational governments' roles in policy-making, facilitation of change will be important and decisive. Subnational governments need to be better integrated in the institutional mechanisms through high-level councils, consultative committees, and so on that are eliciting the coordination and follow-up of the SDGs. The integrated approach of the SDGs offers the opportunity to explore innovative strategies and relations to reinforce the dialogue and the collaborative approaches between all spheres of government. This is not only indispensable for the realization of the SDGs, but it provides unprecedented opportunity to update governance mechanisms and makes them fit for the purpose to face the challenges ahead and to make societal resilience. Progressive and effective decentralization should be at the core of an enabling government for subnational governments and for the localization of the SDGs. The financing of the localization of the SDGs deserves specific attention, but is not sufficiently covered in the national voluntary reviews. Intergovernmental frameworks will be needed that adequately empower, fund, and incentivize subnational governments and international institutions. Finally, our constituency would like to call on the HLPF to provide adequate and specific attention to the localization of the agenda. We are aware that the journey towards the achievement of the SDGs has just begun and that results will not be immediate. We hope our efforts can be properly acknowledged and harnessed upon. In the meantime, allow us to reiterate the commitment of our organized constituency, ready to guarantee the well-being of local and regional governments through contributions to the achievement of the global goals that unite us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Your Honor, your time is so good. I'm going to ask you a quick question, but you're going to give me a brief answer. Okay? Yeah, I know. I'm a bruiser. Okay. So 44 reports. Only 44 mention the subnational. Why?
We continue to work with all of our partners here at the UN to ensure that local governments continue to be at the forefront of this movement, but also all of the various UN agendas. I think the reality is that, in some cases, there's national governments that still haven't convinced themselves, in all due respect, of the important role that local government plays.
That's perfect. Thank you. Indeed. And before we go to the last opening panelist, just for the sake of getting the mental juices flowing, I will be with you in 1 second. I just want to name the next wave of discussants, of speakers that we're going to have. Will include Ms. Penny Abi-Wadina, who's the Commissioner for International Affairs, New York City. Ms. Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of Oxfam International. Welcome to you both. Mr. Mohan Vivekanandan, the Group Executive Development Bank of Southern Africa. And Ms. Heather Grady, Vice President, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. I'm doing you a favor because I'm trying to get your mental juices going because I'm going to come to you after this great opening panel. Are any of you not in the room? Good. Right. So, with no further ado, I'd like to move now to Miss Michelle Giles. Okay. Miss Michelle Giles Madonu, who's the Director, Sustainable Development Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. So, Michelle, the floor is yours for a luxurious 4 minutes.
To everyone, it's really a pleasure to be in such distinguished company, and we're coming from the subnational to the global, but I think that's because the global in this case is truly local. I say that because it is a global agenda, as the Secretary General says, but it is one that can only be delivered where the rubber hits the road, and that's in states, in cities, in communities, urban and rural, and so it is really quite essential that we ensure that this agenda actually gets to people. The agenda is local from my perspective in 2 ways. It's local first, not just because it needs to be actioned at that level, but it's local because its genesis was local. Millions of people actually took part in shaping this agenda. And I think just as in terms of resourcing and financing this agenda to make sure it happens, just as we need to move from the billions to the trillions with making sure that we live up to our commitments on development assistance, but that we mobilize domestic resources, that we build the partnerships that are necessary to be able to leverage the financing that we need to deliver this agenda, we also need to move from millions to 7.5 billion people, and to make sure that this agenda really gets to households, because that's the only way we can make sure that we really do not leave anyone behind. It has to become agenda just as it was developed by people, that sits in the hearts of people, that it resonates with them, and in that resonating, that it gives people, communities, agency to actually take up action. This agenda will not happen in the next 13 years without this kind of community coming together. So the idea of Local 2030 is really to reach out, to connect, to share, to exchange ideas, to help the acceleration in terms of action and achievements that we need in order to make sure that we see the improvements in lives of people. There is a remarkable amount of experience in this room, and we talk a lot about this is a complicated world, it's a complicated agenda. We'll have to break down the silos, and we'll have to see much more whole of government approaches. But just as we look at that horizontal integration across governments, we have to deal with the vertical. We have to make sure that it goes from national to state, right down into our communities and right down into our families, because there's no other chance for this agenda. And so I think we need to take the energy, we need to take the new approaches and the commitments that we now have, and we need to invest in effective decentralization. I think the Honorable Vrbanovich just mentioned that, but decentralization in terms of resources to get the job done, capacities at the local level to be able to work on delivering this agenda, that we're able to leverage the local context and the innovation that is born out of local context. People are innovating every day at all levels, and we need to be able to take that, scale it, exchange it, share it, and make sure that we can move this global community forward. Also important, I think, is the idea that was also raised by Honorable Vrbanovich, which is we also need to ensure that there is meaningful participation of local actors. This is challenging, certainly in the world of the United Nations, an intergovernmental body framed around nation states, but we will have to find effective ways as we deliver on this agenda to make sure that the voices of key local actors come into the room and influence both the policy and the direction and also the action that's taken. We will need all our heads together to make sure that that challenge is actually taken up and that we work on it. And so I think I will stop there just to say that, this is a new way of working. It's a new agenda calling for a new attitude and a new way of working, new forms of collaboration, new forms of participation. We need to move from just engagement to true active collaboration with each other across all levels of government and across all sectors. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here, and I look forward to the outcomes as we try to set up these local 2030 data hubs that we think will, where we can probe the data and find the solutions that are necessary to achieve this agenda. Thank you very much.
That is a super rich panel of experience, a lot to unpack. You have created that great glowing orb, which is now passed into the room. And if these people drop that over the next 2 days, that's their fault, not yours. So thank you very much. Put your hands together properly for those 5 people. Thank you. And I'm serious about that. We've had alignment, that word keeps coming back, silos, data, finance. George Soros, sitting in a meal in Davos, once said, and he silenced the room, I only deal in figures beginning with T. All right? So whether we move from millions to billions or from billions to trillions, that issue of finance and investment is key to this. And as the Deputy Secretary General said, the ability to enhance the creditworthiness of subnationals and local entities and free up those pools of capital is key. So what I would like to now do is open it up. We've got 4 discussants who are going to come in very wisely and sagely at different points. But I would ask first, are there anyone of the 5 on the panel who would like to ask one of the other panel members a quick question or a point or violently disagree? Any of those things? No, we've got shaking heads. That's good. You're all friends, aren't you? I can tell. That's great. All right. Would anyone in the audience, not from the speaking 4, would anyone like to ask a brief question? Well, thank you very much indeed. And you're one of the discussants as well. So, Winnie, welcome. Please, if you could keep your question brief and direct it perhaps to one of the panelists.
A quick question to Michelle. Could you tell us a little more about these local 2030 data hubs? What's the idea behind it and how will they work out?
Michelle, I might take just another question as well so we wrap it around. Obviously, not enough coffee has been had this morning. Can we have some questions? I'm giving you the chance. All I need is a hand, a sign. Yes, please, thank you. If you could introduce yourself very briefly and target your question, and then we'll go to the panel. Thank you.
I am the Deputy Secretary General of United Cities and Local Governments. I'm very pleased to join you here with other members of the Global Task Force. My question is for the national governments that have taken the floor. I don't know if all of them, but maybe one of them can answer. I'm just wondering, when you talk to other national governments that attend this high-level political forum and might not have the same level of involvement of their local governments, do you ever wonder why? What is the difference? Is it a structural difference in the way the governance of the countries work, or is it just a different level of dialogue that they have with local governments? I think we need to start to analyze the why behind the things we are observing. Okay. Thank you very much.
Lovely question of political economy, but we're going to start with Winnie's question on data. Michelle, if you'd like to respond to that, and then if any of the panelists would like to take the second question. Michelle, the floor is yours.
A little bit. I'm going to start very quickly and then pass the buck to somebody else, because it also brings some excitement into the room. So just to say what we see, Winnie, is really a platform that's led by subnational entities working together with our UN country teams around a number of these challenges at city level, around finance, around energy, around data, etc. But what I'd like to do at this point, we've been engaging actively, our UN Statistics Division, with the World Council on City Data, and maybe if I can ask Patricia McCartney to jump in and also just provide some details on this question.
Patricia, the floor is yours. This is a really sexy subject, by the way. Okay. I didn't. I didn't name you. You just named yourself. Go on. Thanks, Patricia. The floor is yours. That's good. There you go.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Okay, now I'm going over here. It's because they didn't want me to talk about data being sexy.
Can't always trust technology. There's a human element. Go on, Patricia. Floor is yours.
So it's a pleasure. I'm Patricia McCartney. I'm the President and CEO of the World Council on City Data and professor at the University of Toronto. So these local data hubs, I have to say, are something that we've had in mind now for a few years, and the Local 2030 event is helping to give it the oomph that we've been wanting and needing for some time, because working with cities on building data over the past now 9 years, we know that the capacity for the technical and the financial capacity for data in local governments is huge. And on-the-ground assistance for technical support and financial support can happen through these hubs. So we are opening 7 data hubs to start with, and we'll be announcing that this afternoon, all over the world. On the ground in Johannesburg, in Mina, Nigeria, in Makati in the Philippines, all around the world, in Dubai, in Los Angeles, Cambridge, who's here, our city manager from Cambridge. These hubs will be on the ground data platforms that can support the Local 2030 agenda going forward, because if you don't have that data, you can't move that needle for investment.
Perfect. So that's a warm-up. Come back this afternoon. That's what Patricia's saying, to hear more. Michelle, 240. Michelle, thank you for that. Thank you for the interaction and for making the microphone work. The second question was around where there isn't that seamless cooperation between national and subnational. Why? Would anyone like to take that? Your Excellency, the Minister from Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe there are some historical reasons why the local government and decentralization isn't that strong in certain countries. What we try to do is to share our experiences from a Swedish perspective. So this year we had dialogue with at least 5 countries where we shared experiences of how we can use decentralization for creating a more efficient and legitimate public sector, how decentralized policy areas can be used as a platform for creating a more sustainable society. And the Swedish experiences are really interesting. And from my point of view, we can use the story of creating the welfare state in Sweden during the 20th century and how it was made in the local and regional level. So the national government just gave the support to municipalities, to the regions, and they were building the public sector services, healthcare, social care, schools, and it has been a quite efficient way to organize the welfare state. So we are more than happy to share our experiences, and I believe that the decentralization aspect of Agenda 2030 is really important if we want to achieve these goals.
Okay, good. Your Excellency, Cesar Chavanez.
If I could add briefly, I think that there is a challenge around political will, if I were to be completely honest, and resources. But I think that there's a capacity, like His Excellency has said, and has been mentioned by many of the panelists, to really have the opportunity to engage local actors, to be active participants in what happens throughout their communities, and have it less of a top-down approach and more of a bottom-up approach. With our new feminist international assistance policy, we are going to be really listening to local players. We are investing money in programs and policies to ensure that the voice of local individuals are integrated in what we do going forward. And that is critically important to whether we're talking about data or we're talking about the quality of life for individuals in a community.
Would it be fair to say, just on the data point, that in terms of not a revolution in data, what's happening with data, which is amazing, different sorts of data, that in terms of grassroots up, from the family, through the community, through the subnational, that accountability chain is being aligned far more effectively. And that ultimately will put national governments and then the multilateral system in the more direct line of accountability, right? Does that worry politicians?
It shouldn't, quite honestly. I was in Grenada a couple of days ago, and they were talking about the capacity of governments within that country, a very small country, to do these town halls. One thing that we do in Canada all the time, we sort of take for granted. They're doing it in, their small communities, and they're allowing local individuals to understand how the SDGs are integrated and how they could help impact the community. So it shouldn't worry governments. It should, in fact, empower them to know that the individuals that they are called to represent at the table are allowing their voices to be integrated into the policies and programs that go forward.
Fantastic. I'm going to go to His Excellency from Tanzania for a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've discovered that without having a National Statistical Bureau to take into account the scaling up of SDG, by understanding what are we talking about in terms of data, they're going to create surveys that will address the requirement of all SDGs and see how best local people are involved and how the SDGs, when they're scaled up, they're impacting the real people on the at local level. So right now they're talking about surveys and data structures, support systems that can help understand how much we are scaling up the SDGs.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think we've got some very important threads here. I am going to now go to our second wave of marvelous discussant speakers and ask Ms. Penny Abe Wadina, who's the Commissioner for International Affairs, New York City. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you fearing? What not fearing, feeling? What jives with your experience in the context of New York? Thank you for your comments. And if you could introduce yourself briefly.
Absolutely. Thank you. Excellencies, colleagues, and honored guests, it's an honor to be here on behalf of Mayor Bill de Blasio. I'm pleased to welcome you to New York City as well to discuss an issue that is also at the top of our city agenda, sustainable development and the critical role that local governments will play in ensuring that the world meets the global goals. The Mayor's Office for International Affairs serves as the primary liaison between the City of New York and the largest diplomatic community in the world. We function as a global platform from which New York City exchanges best practices with the international community to achieve its goals for a more just and equitable society. In New York City, we feel and see the challenges that the SDGs address every day on our streets and in our communities. We have the opportunity, and I think indeed the obligation, to create strategies that are responsive to these challenges and that embed the aspirations of the SDGs within them. Under Mayor de Blasio's leadership, I can say that we have done just that. In April 2015, Mayor de Blasio committed New York City to One NYC. It's our groundbreaking strategic plan for inclusive and sustainable growth. This strategy took stock of New York City's significant challenges and charted a path forward to achieving goals such as lifting 800,000 New Yorkers out of poverty, expanding access to nutritious and affordable food, and ensuring that those on the front lines of climate change, often our most vulnerable New Yorkers, are protected against its risks. Shortly after, my office launched Global Vision Urban Action, an initiative designed to highlight the synergies between the Sustainable Development Goals and New York's local sustainability and development programs. Through Global Vision Urban Action, we've hosted a series of events and site visits that bring together experts and thought leaders working to advance the SDGs at the local level, and our topics in the last couple of years have ranged from mental health and water management to leveling the playing field for women. In 2 years, New York City has made great strides in advancing these global goals. Because of our strong commitment to accountability, we have been tracking our progress, and we see that our streets are safer, our economy is stronger and working for more New Yorkers, and our city continues to lead in the fight against climate change. In June, Mayor de Blasio reaffirmed New York City's commitment to the Paris Agreement, issuing an order to city agencies to adopt the Paris principles and work with other cities, states, and countries to achieve these goals. At this moment, we know that local leadership is more important than ever. We look forward to sharing more about our efforts to achieve the SDGs, as well as explore new opportunities, as my colleague over there said, to exchange best practices and scale up what's working. Thank you.
Commissioner, thank you very much for bringing that perspective, and a city which is clearly, you've got the SDGs on your brochures already, right? So you're driving hard. I would like to, as a moderator at this point, I'm sort of excited in that we've actually got time for a conversation. So please put your hands together for yourselves, because by clapping, you avoid DVT. A lot of you have taken flights. Put your hands together. That's more of a blood flow thing, all right? So I haven't lost anyone yet to DVT in a meeting. Does everyone know what DVT is? Okay, it doesn't matter. Deep vein thrombosis. It's not what you want. You can go to meetings and get that. It's a terrible thing. So have we got any questions out there from any random people before we go to our next discussant? Commissioner, again, thank you for that. Oof, we're going to have to work this audience. Oh, sorry. You have to escape. Right. Not at all. Thank you very much for joining us. We know how busy it is during the forum. And thank you for your comments. That's really appreciated. Your Excellency, have a good remainder of the high-level political forum. And again, thank you for joining us. So I'm actually going to go to our next discussant, and it is Miss Winnie Bianyima, who is the Executive Director for Oxfam International. And I would ask you for your comments in terms of what you've heard so far, what are the key issues. And Oxfam obviously brings a wonderfully international perspective, working in some of the most difficult and vulnerable parts of the world. So the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you. And it's really an honor to be participating in Local 2030 discussion, and thank you, Office of the Deputy Secretary General, for leading this. It makes me so happy to speak after the representative of the New York City mayor. It goes without saying that we cannot make the Sustainable Development Goals a reality without local government. It's at the local level. We see authorities interacting most closely with the everyday lives of people. Whether they are collecting our garbage, educating our children, or transporting us to work, we see it every day. If we are going to make the SDGs a success, it's vital that policies made at the national level are implemented effectively, efficiently at the local level. But I would argue that even more importantly, and it would even be more exciting to see the ideas for implementation coming from the local level and becoming national or even global policies. So what I want to bring to this discussion today is the role of civil society as a vital actor, a vital local actor. And with that, then the need to protect that space where civil society can engage. I had the pleasure to speak at the signing of the SDGs at a special event convened by the Secretary General. And at that meeting, where I had my 3 minutes, I said that the SDGs must be, that the path to their delivery must be tangible, must be political, and must be disruptive. That's the promise of the goals. To do this, we need to put power in the hands of citizens. Whether these citizens are community groups, women's groups, youth groups, or groups organized around work, it is about people exercising civic power through organizing collectively. Sometimes this might be alliances of citizens working with local governments to implement the Agenda 2030, but sometimes it will be civil society alliances holding local governments accountable for implementation. Both must work. Let me give 2 examples of how civic action can improve the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. In Honduras, 2 years ago, Oxfam and our partners worked through a civil society coalition to do a social audit of the budget to analyze the government's commitment to gender equality. The audit compared expenditures against legal commitments, against allocations that were planned to help fight gender-based violence. We also looked at the impact of tax policy on women, those 2 areas. The findings formed the basis for an alternative budget proposal. The group, the alliance, worked across party lines to create wide support for the creation of what are now called municipal offices for women. These are intended to increase the responsiveness to women's needs at the local level and to assure adequate local budget allocation to projects that specifically benefit women, a real tangible outcome for women. In another example I want to give, and that's my last point, Oxfam works with partners in Kenya to hold local authorities to account for how money is spent on public services. In Nairobi, one of our partners is called the National Taxpayers Association. Very proud of this. It recruits volunteers who then monitor how money is spent in their communities. community auditors identify poor public services and they review the budgets against what has been spent and demand for improvements. They check whether money is actually delivering what it is intended to do. We know that domestic resource mobilization at the local and the national level will be vital for meeting the SDGs. Without citizens like these providing accountability and transparency of domestic resource collection and spending, we will not achieve the sustainable development goals. So such examples require that civic space is protected and expanded. Citizens must have the freedom to express and inform themselves, to assemble, to associate, to participate without discrimination, and to enjoy their basic human rights and the rule of law. In fact, that is SDG 16, about the importance of public access to information and the protection of fundamental freedoms to achieve sustainable development. But if civil society can't play this vital role, we will not achieve the 2030 agenda of leaving no one behind. And let me end by throwing a challenge to the UN system and the member states represented, who represent their countries here, the representatives. There is a committee here called the NGO committee that is supposed to go through and make sure that, and screen and accredit organizations of civil society representing here at ECOSOC. These days I hear that the NGO committee is now called the anti-NGO committee. It does its job in such a way that it spends more time screening out than screening in NGOs to monitor what governments do here. That's not the way to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We want to see leadership from the UN itself on expanding and protecting civic space. That is my last challenge. So I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Winnie. I love Oxfam. You're always challenging, but I'm going to challenge you back. So, absolutely. That's why I love you. But how would you change the system you've just mentioned so that it's springing people in, not springing out? What specifically and very briefly would you do?
Well, you've asked a very important question, because today around the world, governments are moving in the opposite direction from the leave no one behind agenda by putting in place more laws to restrict civil society, whether in the name of fighting terrorism or fighting whatever. So we want to see the repeal of laws that are closing down civic space, closing down media, closing down civil society organizations. So the repeal of these laws is very important, and the UN should take the lead here. We would like to see financing for civil society organizations not being frustrated by the new rules that are against aid diversion. The most vulnerable people need resources from the global community to fight and to improve their living conditions. These channels, these flows are being closed in the name of anti-aid diversion. Those are two of the things that need to be done.
Do any of the panelists want to come back immediately and briefly on that point, or not? Not. Okay. Winnie, thank you for your contribution. And again, I'm offering that chance because we've got a richness of time to a certain extent before we go to our next panelist. Any thoughts, questions, points, clarifications? The gentleman in the light grey suit, who is His Excellency Adam Vaughan. Welcome, and please, ask your question to one of the panelists.
As my colleague Selena departed, I'm the Parliamentary Secretary in charge of Urban Affairs and Housing under Social Development in the Government of Canada, but has spent most of my time as a municipal councillor, a local government activist who snuck into the national government to try and change it. In large part because of what I think is the issue that's sort of at tension on the table right now, which is how do you empower local governments, cities and municipalities to be strong actors when in fact quite often in national governments, cities are either played off against one another or played off against rural areas and in fact are a threat to national government and sometimes the political structure of national governments. And so the challenge is that national governments often don't like cities. They don't talk to each other about how good their cities are doing. It's left to cities quite often to talk to each other. And the common ground on the SDGs emerges from the municipal sector because cities don't attack each other. The cities tend to collaborate naturally rather than compete. And I guess the challenge to the United Nations, and I'd be interested to see how it will address this, is that you have united cities right across the globe. The example of budgeting that was talked about in Honduras comes from Brazil. The Brazilian government didn't share that with the Honduran government. Point Alegre shared that with the cities in Honduras, and it was shared organically. So I guess the question is how do you support cities talking to each other when national governments quite often not only don't trust their own cities, but when they want to make a point, they destroy each other's cities? And how do we get cities back at the forefront of this conversation when national governments are driving the agenda here at the United Nations?
Barry and the Minister, both of you are twitching. That's good. So I'll go to His Excellency first. Yes, Barry, the Honourable, and then the Minister. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to have to thank Adam for his comments, and I think I would be remiss if I didn't say to his question. I think the way you do it, quite frankly, is you find opportunities for national governments to support initiatives like our global body, United Cities and Local Governments, which is trying to further facilitate local governments talking. So as an example, the European Union has been making a significant investment the last couple years into UCLG to help further partnerships in amongst different parts of the world in UCLG, and quite frankly, without that, we wouldn't have been able to expand our network over the last few years in the way that we have.
Barry, thank you very much indeed, and Your Excellency, Minister.
Thank you. Aside the UCLG and other national organizations organizing cities and regions, it is very important that we have these kind of platforms. And I believe this initiative, Local 2030, is a great platform which gives municipalities and regions the opportunity to change, to share experiences, to have a dialogue. And it is a duty for us, for national states, to support these kind of initiatives, to give the right support to the United Nations, to focus on local and regional governments in this process of implementing Agenda 2030. Local and regional governments are not threats toward the national government in this process. We need the partnership between the different levels if we want to achieve the goals.
Michelle, if you can come in briefly, thank you.
I think this is a very vexing but a very important question. And as I indicated in my remarks, it's not an easy one, but one that I think the United Nations and its member states need to be able to find a more effective solution to. We are undergoing, the Secretary General has initiated a reform process of the United Nations to ensure that these goals can be delivered by 2030 in countries. And you know, he shared his vision at the end of last month, at least on the reform of the development system, where a lot of this support comes in. Currently, there's also a review of UN Habitat, which is the organization that works with cities and human settlements. And I think some of these questions are the very questions that are challenging those members of the panel who are trying to resolve these issues, because civic space is important. Civic space for the individual, but also those platforms on which cities engage is also ensuring that we protect civic space. The UN works in different parts of the world, and by trying to provide some of these platforms. I know very well one in Latin America of the network of local governments. And you're very right. It's that event where cities come together and local authorities come together, and it's a hub of exchange of ideas and innovation, but it doesn't really bubble up to the national level. It is not a question, I think, that we will solve overnight, but one that needs urgent change as we think through this reform process through to the end of December as to how we engage local actors and city actors in a much more effective way.
David, you've started a really good thread. I'm going to go to His Excellency from Tanzania, but just first, in terms of how we're going to fold this, I'm then going to come to our next two speakers, from Development Bank of Southern Africa and from Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors to do back-to-back, and then we've still got a few minutes for questions, okay? So our colleague from Tanzania, Your Excellency,
yeah, thank you very much.
Finish this thread.
I'm going to think aloud beyond the current conversation. The local government deals with regulation, deals with the laws that govern the local management of the country. And then the city have got two components. It has associated itself with regulation, but also it has got a market mechanism of how to do its business. It has to ensure that whatever it has to do as a city, it delivers by using market mechanism. So the meeting between these two, local government and the cities, is that you have to fuse in the components of market mechanism of how the city they do it, and the local government, they put oversight on the regulation so that the players in the marketplace of the city do not actually abuse the system, so that the city can be vibrant. And the combination of two needs a further conversation that can put them together and to see where they meet and where they don't meet. And the private sector is also a component to this, and non-state actors. So a combination of all them together, you can redefine again how cities, the local government authorities, private sector, non-state actors can work together to get it right. And this way we can redefine the goals that are actually part and parcels of the combination of the partnership of these two. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you. Gordon Brown, the former UK Prime Minister, not too long ago said that political economy had gone out of fashion and we need to start studying it again. And what I'm hearing, and I agree with him, what I'm hearing there is that societies are complex and there's many different moving parts, and we need to think a lot harder than we have been perhaps in the past. So thank you for those comments. Now, my favorite subject, DBSA is not my favorite subject, but finance investment, and I believe you've come a long way from Midrand, so thank you for joining us. So I will give the floor to Mr. Mohan Vivekanandan, who's the Group Executive, DBSA, and 3 minutes are yours, and then straight on to Rockefeller.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity for the DBSA to be present here and to be able to share our thoughts. That's good. In terms of our mandate is to use infrastructure to promote economic growth, improve the quality of life of people, and to promote regional integration within the African continent. We're based in Johannesburg. And really, I think the couple of the points that I wanted to touch on are around the role of local entities and then also the gaps in financing. What we try and do is to identify those projects that are bankable and bring them through that chain, so to provide capability and financing in the early stages, to do the technical studies to ensure that the right projects get funded, and then find ways through our own balance sheet, but also crowding in other investors, including the private sector, to ensure those projects get built. Having said that, though, one of the critical elements is somebody has to pay for this infrastructure. And what we're seeing also is that one of the critical themes that maybe hasn't fully been touched on is this impact around urbanization. So if we think about the African continent, already you're looking at about 1.2 billion people. That amount will at least double in the next couple of decades. And there's a significant amount of urbanization taking place. Already in South Africa, the level of urbanization is around 60 to 65%. The same amounts will happen throughout the countries within sub-Saharan Africa. I was just in Dar es Salaam. It took my colleagues 3 hours to get from the airport to their hotel in Dar es Salaam. The same amount of time it took to fly from Johannesburg to Dar es Salaam. You know, it's just not credible. And if we don't invest in the right types of infrastructure in our cities, we're not going to have economic growth, and the quality of life of the people will just not improve. I think one of the issues is a lot of the cities don't have the ability to raise financing off of their own balance sheets. In the case of South Africa, the Constitution provides for 20-25% of funding to go from the national fiscus, where it's raised constitutionally, through to the local governments. So many of the local governments do have that capability, but not all. In the rest of the continent, very, very few cities are what we as a banker would say is bankable, meaning we couldn't fund pretty much any of those cities outside of South Africa on their own balance sheets, which means they're always going to be reliant on the national fiscus or someone else to be able to raise the critical funding for sewerage and water, for urban transport, and so on and so forth. So we need to find ways for these cities to be able to build up their balance sheets, to have access to funding through taxes, to be able to fund these critical infrastructure. And I think the other one last element that I do want to speak on is one around capacity. We find that very few cities are able to plan into the long term to be able to fund the 20, 30-year infrastructure that's required. So, you know, we built up the capability and to provide that support, and I think that's something that the broader global community can also help provide to these cities, especially in less developed countries, so that, you know, they've got the capacity to plan ahead and then match that with the very little amount of financing that they do have to ensure that critical infrastructure does get put into these cities. Thank you very much.
Mohan, thank you. That's a whole new different bag of issues which are incredibly important. Heather, I will come to you in about 60 seconds, maybe a bit more, but I'm selfishly, as the moderator with the microphone, going to ask you a question which obsesses me. So the big pools of capital are the pension funds and insurance resorts, and they're typically in the global north. But those pension pots are really beginning to grow now in the global south. I mean, South Africa has a very big one. How do you deal with the issue of, in terms of projects, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of project finance, the sort of addiction to dollar-denominated loans, right? And how do we free up the local pools of capital, the local pension funds which are beginning to build, to invest in their own infrastructure? I would love your brief perspective on that.
I think it's a really important question, and unfortunately the answer isn't very positive. You know, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa is pretty much the only country that can finance infrastructure in its own local currency. Pretty much every single other country, you have to finance it in dollars or euros. I mean, and we operate throughout the continent, and in every one of those areas, we basically finance it in a hard currency. And it's very detrimental to those countries because of, you know, the impact around foreign exchange risk that they take on in doing that. I think you're right. The long-term plan is to have local markets that can provide 20-year capital so that the liabilities against these long-term assets are matched. Unfortunately, you know, it just doesn't exist right now. I think a lot of the countries, Nigeria, some others, are building that up. But the reality is it is going to take quite a while for that to build up. I mean, I think there are some good examples. If you look at Ethiopia with the financing of the Grand Renaissance Dam, where they tapped local investors in local currency to build that when they were sort of shut out a little bit from some of the global access. So there are some good examples, but very few. And it's something that, it's a nut that we need to crack to be able to help these countries in building the infrastructure they need.
I might come back to you on monoline insurance later, which is another of my sessions. Heather, you've been super patient and we appreciate it. So Heather Grady, who's the Vice President, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, the floor is yours for a 3 to 4 minute stint, and then we'll begin to close the conversation. But thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Excellencies and organizers, thank you for inviting me today. Philanthropy is a sector that brings billions of dollars each year to the Sustainable Development Goals, often not invited to events like this, so I appreciate the invitation. And often we are focused on precisely this level. Our knowledge and our commitment is at the local level, working in cities, at districts, provinces, and states. So my overarching message today is complementing what we've already heard, that philanthropy not only can be, but must be a partner in the SDGs and including at the localization agenda. A few years ago, my organization with UNDP and the Foundation Center, the three of us set up the SDG Philanthropy Platform. If you're interested in learning more, there are two websites, sdgfunders.org and sdgphilanthropy.org, which talk about the data from 5 million grants and the data from activities we're doing in focus countries. This is really to encourage philanthropy to use the SDG framework for their work and to open the doors to philanthropy to be a better partner. It includes big foundations that are household names like Gates and Rockefeller. It includes family foundations, and it includes impact investors. There are over 90,000 foundations in the US, over 110,000 in Europe, and thousands in India, China, and emerging markets across the world. Our platform has a focus, and this is just an example, in 8 countries. And so I want to give you some examples of our work there. In Kenya, we have foundations that are interested in early childhood development and taking work that is very successful in one district in Kenya and experimenting with how to expand it to other districts in the country. In Zambia, we're working on the well-being of children, and we've mobilized the Catholic sisters who want to be agents of change to support the SDGs, to work in localities across Zambia. In Ghana, we're finding local water projects that are very successful and sustainable and helping them to scale up to be more well-known at the national and the international level. In Colombia, we're partnering with a very good organization called AFE, which is a partnership of 60+ Colombian foundations. And they're working on a peace-building agenda that we agreed in our launch in Colombia 3 years ago. They're working in a local area called Antioquia, which is working on how to bring water and sanitation and other development interventions for this very important agenda, Goal 16 on peace building, with the idea that we cannot achieve Goal 16 without achieving the other goals, and we can't achieve the other goals without achieving Goal 16. Working with something called Mission to Transform Rurality. So these are real solid partnerships between philanthropy and local level actors. In the United States, where we see that the SDG agenda perhaps isn't getting that much traction at the federal level, we actually have a lot of interest at the local level in cities across the country. We heard about New York, in San Jose, California, in Little Rock, Arkansas, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The SDGs are actually a very exciting agenda for local organizations and local government and local businesses. And just one more example in India, connecting the local partners of foundations like the Oak Foundation, working on gender equality, and connecting them with different UN agencies and with those working at the national level. I want to end by saying that we're also working on cross-cutting approaches, using machine learning and other technologies to unlock whole new approaches to data, because the approaches we have are simply not good enough. We are working with system change experts like Benny Banerjee at Stanford University on how to use systems transformation to scale up the SDGs, starting with local perspectives and local context. We're working at funding local level catalytic grants in our countries in Africa to see what works to allow them to innovate and experiment. And finally, working with impact investors to use this brand new taxonomy of the SDGs to help them to find more investments at the very local level, not just the famous big players in the United States and elsewhere. So I hope that this has whet your appetite for wanting to work more with the philanthropy sector. Thank you.
Heather, thank you very much. We've got 2 minutes to close and finish off. I think we have a conversation. That's what we have on our hands. And thanks to Your Excellency for joining us, and thank you to the Swedish government. I know you've played a fundamental role in this, so thank you. Have a good forum. There's too much information and too much complexity to summarize. But I think what the panel has done this morning, and that's what I encourage people to come back at 1:30 once we break, to really dig into some of the deep issues, capacity building, data, poverty alleviation, and we've got some great panels. What is absolutely clear is that, and I think the Her Excellency, the Deputy Secretary General, captured it wonderfully well, is Local 2030 Hub is an opportunity to do different in the Latin, in terms of different actors working together, whether it's in policy, whether it's in technology, whether it's in data, but actually coming up with models which directly impact those four words, those left furthest behind. And that's, I think, a critical thing there. So I'm not going to drag it out. I'm going to leave one last personal observation. Okay. So I left the UN 5 years ago, set up my little business, and I'm involved in asset management. And in a way that the MDGs never did it, the SDGs have created, I suppose it's maybe not impolite, but it's a cat fight in the investment industry. People are rushing to get product out, whether it's equity, fixed income, whether it's real estate, whether it's alternative. In a way I've never seen it before in the investment industry, and this is global, people have gone, that's a framework that we can play products into the market against, we can manage money against, we can mobilize money. And that's not a figment of my imagination, that is happening now. So we are moving from that billions to trillions, and I think that is part of the genius of the SDGs. It's not just 17, it's your 169 KPI and your 230, all those marvelous things which are structured in. So we have a rarefied opportunity to connect large pools of capital, which is fundamentally owned by the nurses, the firemen, the policemen, the low-level civil servants, in those big pension pots. We can mobilize that. We can mobilize more development capital in and around the SDGs, and that's what excites me. So I would like to close by thanking each one of our panelists and our discussants for really, creating that, I framed it as a glowing orb of energy that will lift us through the next 2 days, and then report back to you in terms of the concrete decisions out of this fora. So please put your hands together. I'm going to whip through very, very quickly. The minister's gone. Thank you to His Excellency Mero from Tanzania, to the Honorable Berry Vranovic from Kitchener, also Michelle Gilles Madonna from the Secretary General's office, Penny, who's left. Winnie, thank you very much for Oxfam's input and your challenge. Also to Mr. Vivekanandan from DBSA. Thank you very much for bringing finance and investment. And finally to Heather. That's been a marvelous, marvelous morning. It's 12:02. We're 2 minutes over time. Give yourself a pat on the back and come back at 1:30. Thank you.